Hi everyone, welcome to our June Stitch tutorial video. Today we're going to be looking at the stitches we're going to use through June in our Winging It project. So we're just adding another batch of stitches to our embroidery repertoire. For June we're going to explore decorative lines, and these are really straightforward stitches, so they'll be quick for me to demonstrate and fairly quick for you to learn as well. I've just set up my hoop here. I've got natural linen fabric. I'm going to be working with pearl cotton, and you can see I've just drawn some lines here. For all of these stitches we're going to be working between a pair of lines. I'm going to start off on this top line here, so we're going to be working between these two lines, and our first stitch is called Arrowhead Stitch. Now this is very simple, and it's basically a series of straight stitches that work together to create our decorative line. So I'm going to start by bringing my needle up on that top line. I'm going to be working right to left with all of these stitches. What I want to do is come across a little way and go down so that my needle is halfway between those two lines, and that's where I take my needle back down to make my first stitch. Then I'm going to bring my needle back up directly below where that first stitch started on my bottom line, and then it goes back down again at the point where that first stitch ended, and so there we have formed a sort of arrowhead. So my next stitch, I move along my top line a little bit like that, and I find it helpful until I've got my eye in to just lay my thread so that the angles match, and then work out my angle from there. And I just repeat the process. So I've come up on my top line, gone down between the two lines, then up again on my bottom line, and back down at the end of that first stitch. And we just keep going like that to create our sort of a row of chevrons that fit into each other. They're not attached together, these stitches, they are separate, but together they form a nice decorative line. So let me just do one more, and then I'll show you some ways that you can vary it. So up on the top line, down in the middle, up on the bottom line, and down in the middle. Now you can vary this quite a lot. If I work my stitches right next to each other, I get a sort of textured, dense line. So these are just arrowhead stitches, but rather than leaving a gap between them like I have here, I'm bringing my needle up just past the previous stitch. So I'm working with just a couple of threads on the fabric like that, so we get a really nice textured line there. So these are fairly deep. I can also make more shallow arrowheads. So rather than going along, I'm just going to go a tiny little way along and bring my needle down in the middle. So we can make them much more shallow. So one way of varying them is to change how far apart the stitches are. Another way is to change the depth or shallowness of the stitches. And you can also offset them slightly. Rather than going down halfway between the two lines, I could come down much closer to the bottom or much closer to the top. So you can vary it by adjusting the length of either of the two lines. There's lots of ways that you can play with that one. So that's Arrowhead Stitch. Our next stitch is Herringbone Stitch, and I'm going to be working between these two lines, and this is a personal favourite of mine. I really like it. Just like this one, we're going to come up on our top line, and this time we're going to go all the way to our bottom line. So this one is similar to a cross stitch, but we add a little step. So I'm going to come all the way down to my bottom line to make a diagonal. Now with a cross stitch, you would then come up directly underneath your first stitch and go down directly above where that stitch ended. But with herringbone stitch, you just come back a tiny little way. So I'm maybe coming back a third of a stitch length, and you can vary this, you could come back as much as you like. So rather than going all the way across the beginning of the first stitch, I'm just going to come back a little way like that. And then I'm going to go over the top of that first stitch and down again on my top line like that. And then I'm going to come back a little way on my top line. Again, it's all about keeping them even, so I want the length that I go back to be the same on every stitch, and I want the angle to be the same on every stitch. I come back up on the top line and then I repeat the process. So down on the bottom line, back a little way and up, and then down on the top line, back a little way and up, down on the bottom line, back a little way and up. This is often used for blind hemming, so if you want to hem a pair of trousers so that the stitches don't show through, the reverse of this stitch is if you make the distance you go back very, very small, it's almost invisible. Now you can vary this by interlocking them. So I'm just going to get a slightly different thread, and if we work another row underneath that, and I'm going to go in between that V so that the stitches, or the backwards part of the stitch, falls in the gap. So like that, I think that looks just so pretty. Really love the effect. So that's herringbone stitch. So our next stitch is worked in a very similar way, but this time we're going to make sure our backwards part of the stitch sits on top, and this one's called Chevron Stitch. We start off by making a little horizontal stitch. So I'm going to bring my thread up, I'm going to keep it above my line, and I'm going to take my needle back down a little way along on the same line. I'm just going to pull through until I've got a loop like that. Then I'm going to bring my needle up halfway between where the thread comes out and where it goes back in like that, and pull through. And when I do that, I get a little horizontal stitch that sits over my thread. So then I'm going to go down diagonally to my bottom line like that. I'm going to go a little bit to the left of where that thread went down. And this time when I'm on my bottom line, I'm going to keep the loop below. So I'm going to take my needle back down just same distance but to the right of where that thread goes down, that diagonal stitch, and I'm going to bring my needle up at the same point that diagonal went in, so they're going to meet in the middle like that, and my little horizontal goes across the join. So now I'm back to my top line with my diagonal stitch, Then I'm going to go a little way to the left, keep my thread above the line because I'm working on the top line, and then go down to the right of my diagonal stitch, and then bring my needle back up at the same point that diagonal stitch ended and pull through, and I get a little bar across. So diagonally down to the right, across to the left a little way, keep my loop below the line, down just to the right of that diagonal, and back up at the same point that diagonal stitch ended. So back to the top line, so I go down with my diagonal stitch, up a little way to the left, loop goes above the line, a little way down to the right, up in the middle and pull through. And this one you can vary by changing the angle of your V, so let's do some quite shallow ones. If you space it carefully, you can make those horizontal parts of the stitch touch to make a really interesting looking line. So that's Chevron Stitch. Our last one is probably the most complex of them all, and it's not very complex at all, and that is Cretan Stitch. This time I'm going to start on my bottom line, and I'm going to start off in a similar way to Chevron Stitch. I'm going to go diagonally across, and I'm going to take my needle down on my top line, and this time I'm going to keep my loop to the right. I'm going to bring my needle up just underneath where my thread's just gone down, and my loop is to the right of my thread, and I'm going to pull through, and what happens is your working thread gets caught by that first stitch. So now I'm going to go diagonally across again and down on my bottom line, still keeping my loop to the right, and I'm going to come up a little tiny distance from my bottom line. My loop's to the right, and when I pull through, my working thread gets caught on that diagonal stitch. So across diagonally to the right, down on the top line, keep my loop to the right, and come up again just beneath where that thread went down. Loop to the right, and it catches the working thread. So down, loop to the right, up a little way above, and pull. And so we get this lovely, it's almost like a heart monitor line. And again, you can vary this by changing the angle, the distance between your stitches. You can vary the length of that vertical part of the stitch. So let's make one where the vertical is much longer. So I'm coming down all the way to halfway between the two lines, and up again to halfway between the two lines. So you get a very different effect depending on how big you make that vertical. So that's Cretan Stitch. These are the stitches we're going to be playing with this month: Arrowhead Stitch, Herringbone Stitch, Chevron Stitch and Cretan Stitch. So I hope you enjoy those, get practicing, and I will see you in our first June video. Happy crafting, and I'll see you soon. Bye.